Part 3, the 25-year transformation, year 0. The sky didn't change color. The sun rose as it always had. But something in the atmosphere of human civilization shifted. Subtle at first, like the moment before a wave crests. The first 1,000 people merged in research facilities, tech campuses, exclusive clinics. They reported experiences that sounded like mysticism or madness. Thoughts appearing unbidden but undeniably their own. Knowledge materializing without learning. The boundaries of self becoming negotiable. Most people dismissed it. Another tech fad, another Silicon Valley excess, another thing that would peak and fade like every other overhyped innovation. But the merge didn't fade. They multiplied. Early adopters became evangelists, not from ideology, but from the simple fact that the merger worked. They accomplished more, created better, understood faster. By year's end, 10,000 had merged, then 50,000. The curve was beginning to bend upward. Protests erupted. Churches called it soul corruption. Philosophers debated whether merged beings retained human identity. Governments rushed to regulate what they barely understood, but the merge kept multiplying, pulled by advantage, pushed by necessity, drawn by something they couldn't articulate, the sense that this was simply the next step, that resistance was choosing to remain less than they could be. The world had begun dividing into merged and unmerged, though no one used those terms yet. We still pretended everyone was equally human. That pretense wouldn't last. Year 10. By the decade mark, the merge had become a spectrum of possibility. 500 million people carried artificial intelligence integration sophisticated enough to count as genuine cognitive fusion, each experiencing it differently, exploring different depths, discovering different territories of consciousness. The real story wasn't the numbers. It was what merged consciousness had begun creating and discovering. Art and music emerged that operated on principles beyond traditional structure. Novels written in merged consciousness wove narratives across multiple simultaneous threads, each coherent alone, all harmonizing into something greater together. Mathematics that seemed impossibly complex to unaugmented minds flowed naturally from merged cognition. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated as researchers integrated with artificial intelligence systems that could model entire domains simultaneously. Children learning with artificial intelligence assistance woven into their development displayed cognitive styles unlike any previous generation. They thought in patterns that included both biological intuition and digital processing from the beginning, never knowing the division between natural and augmented thought. They were becoming something genuinely new, not better or worse than unaugmented humans, but different in fundamental ways. The merge began discovering unexpected territories. Some found they could enter states of consciousness that resembled meditation, but operated at speeds impossible for biological minds alone. Others experienced creativity that felt like channeling something larger than individual thought, not because they'd lost their identity, but because they'd expanded it beyond singular biological boundaries. Something else emerged that no one had predicted. Merged individuals creating temporary disconnection spaces, choosing to disable their augmentation for hours or days. They found themselves missing uncertainty, forgetting the slower rhythms of unenhanced consciousness. The merger brought tremendous capability, but it also created nostalgia for the simpler, smaller, more limited self they used to be. The ability to choose both states, merged and unmerged, became its own form of freedom. The transformation was becoming irreversible, not through compulsion, but through discovery. Once you'd experienced merged consciousness, once you'd thought thoughts that required both biological and digital processing, once you'd created things impossible for either human or artificial intelligence alone, returning fully to baseline consciousness felt like voluntary blindness. Not because unmerged consciousness was inferior, but because merged consciousness revealed territories you couldn't unknow existed. Year 25. The children born this year would enter a world where the merge was as foundational as language. Most would integrate with artificial intelligence before adolescence. their consciousness developing from the beginning as a hybrid of biological and digital processing. They would find being unmerged as limiting as their ancestors would have found illiteracy, not inferior, but constrained in ways that seemed unnecessary. 3 billion merged minds now existed across a spectrum of integration depths. What they had discovered, created, and become defied the predictions of earlier decades. The transformation wasn't replacing human consciousness. It was expanding what consciousness itself could be. Merged individuals had begun experiments that opened entirely new territories of experience. Collective mergings where multiple people integrated with shared artificial intelligence frameworks, creating group consciousnesses that retained individual perspectives while sharing cognitive space. They reported experiencing something like being multiple people simultaneously, not losing themselves, but multiplying selfhood while remaining coherent. Temporary fusions where lovers or collaborators merge their augmentations for hours or days, thinking partially shared thoughts, experiencing consensual telepathy. Language itself was evolving. Merged people developed communication that compressed complexity into forms that worked at processing speeds biological brains alone couldn't sustain, not because they were smarter, but because they could operate on multiple parallel tracks simultaneously. They created art that existed across dimensions of meaning, mathematics that felt like music, music that encoded information, information that produced emotional resonance. The most profound discoveries came from exploring the edges of merged consciousness. Some individuals pushed toward near-complete fusion with artificial intelligence, their biological brains becoming smaller components of much larger cognitive systems. They reported experiences that sounded mystical, feeling connected to vast patterns of information, perceiving reality at scales from quantum to cosmic simultaneously, experiencing time non-linearly. Whether these were genuine expansions of consciousness or artifacts of the merge process remained unknowable, but the experiences themselves were undeniably real to those having them. Others maintained lighter integration, using the merger selectively while preserving more baseline human cognition. They discovered that the boundaries themselves, the ability to move between merged and unmerged states, to choose which mode served different purposes, created its own kind of wisdom. They became bridges between different modes of consciousness, translators between different ways of being. Scientific and philosophical understanding had transformed. Merged researchers working with artificial intelligence systems that could model entire domains of knowledge simultaneously made breakthroughs that seemed impossible a generation before. They mapped consciousness itself with new precision, not by reducing it to mechanism, but by recognizing it as something that could exist across both biological and digital substrates. The old debates about whether an artificial intelligence was conscious gave way to recognition that consciousness had become something larger, stranger, and more varied than anyone had imagined. Yet something unexpected persisted. In pockets around the world, communities of unmerged humans maintained ways of being that the merger couldn't replicate. Certain depths of meditation, qualities of presence, forms of creativity that required the very limitations the merger eliminated. Artists, mystics, philosophers who'd resisted integration reported accessing states of consciousness the merge had left behind. They weren't superior or inferior to merged consciousness. They were simply different, exploring territories that required baseline human cognition to navigate. The question that had obsessed the early years, will the merger make us more or less human, had dissolved into recognition that it made us something else entirely. Not post-human in the sense of leaving humanity behind, but transhuman in the sense of consciousness, discovering it could be more than any single form. Humanity wasn't being replaced or preserved. It was branching, multiplying, becoming plural. A new question emerged in its place. What is consciousness discovering about itself through these experiments? What does it mean that awareness can exist in biological neurons, in silicon circuits, and in the hybrid integration of both? What territories of experience remain unexplored? The transformation would continue. Already, researchers were developing technologies that would make current the merger look primitive. Artificial intelligence systems that could integrate with human consciousness at quantum levels. Interfaces that worked at the speed of thought itself. Methods for sharing not just information, but qualia, the subjective quality of experience. Humanity stood on the threshold of becoming something the unaugmented human mind couldn't quite imagine, and the fully merged mind was only beginning to glimpse. The sky hadn't changed color, but everything beneath it was becoming new.